Hi, I'm Gareth Kane, and welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ollie Taylor, founder of Marine Futures, to talk all things maritime sustainability. Welcome to the podcast, Ollie.
Hi, Gareth. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to get into this topic.
Great. And we always ask our guests how they did get into the topic. How did you get started in sustainability?
Yeah, so I started in the marine industry probably about 16, 17 years ago. So straight out of education, had a big passion for boats. So went into the marine industry to kind of work on more product development, sales, marketing, the commercial part of the business. And through that journey, about 8 years ago, with a manufacturer I was working for at the time, we were looking for how do we kind of decarbonize the products we make? How do we make them lower impact? Because we realized some of the impact we were having was probably quite negative. So our initial kind of view of the industry was to look to other industries, like lots of people do, to see what the automotive market was doing. So a lot of boats in the markets we operated in often used marinized automotive engines, sometimes from the heavy industry side, so diggers and those sorts of machines, take those big diesel engines and put them in boats. So we thought that's a logical place to start, and went on this big journey of trying to find an electric drivetrain, because we assumed that was exactly what we needed to do. You know, we didn't need to look at the rest of the product. It was just, let's swap the drivetrain. Did that for several years, found huge technical challenges around energy densities, and a boat behaves very differently to a car in terms of how much energy is required and drag and all those sorts of things. But in that process, we also stumbled across life cycle assessment, which was a tool to measure the impact of a product across kind of production, use, and end of life phases of its life cycle, and measure, you know, what are we creating today in terms of impact? And if we were to make a change to a different system, what would that create in terms of impact? And it was through that process that we then had some really interesting findings, which I'm sure we'll discuss later, that kind of stimulated something in my mind of like, wow, this is data that the industry doesn't have today. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could share this with more people, so we're always making the right choices, not the wrong choices, if our goal is to reduce our impact? It started in industry, ended up then going to consultancy, to specialize in life cycle assessment, and run a project called Marine Shift 360. Did that for a few years, and then realized, actually, I think there's much more we could be doing, and then set up my own business, Marine Futures, a couple of years ago, to really dive into the marine industry specifically, with product development, kind of low impact innovation, strategy, but always using life cycle assessment as this central tool to enable decarbonisation in the right way, not the wrong way.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you say, we will dig into that in a lot of detail. But first, I'd like to look at the big picture, because maritime emissions, some people may not realize this, like aviation, are not covered by the Paris Agreement, and they're roughly about 3% of global emissions, depending on how you count it, of course, which we will get on to counting things later on. Whereas it's the International Maritime Organization has been leading on cutting maritime emissions, and it has been trying to agree a net zero by 2050 or thereabouts target based on cap and trade, but that's become quite a political hot potato, you know. But you know, what's your view of this? You know, how technically possible is it, and what are the political challenges to overcome?
Yeah, I think, I split it. You've done it nicely there with the technical and the political challenge. So technically, I think it's absolutely feasible. There's a huge range of options that could decarbonize what you'd call the maritime sector. So commercial shipping, container shipping, bulk freight shipments, all of those sorts of vessels. And you've got methanol, ammonia, ethanol, hydrogen. There's lots of different options, which are all in different stages of maturity in terms of development. The bigger technical challenge, I would say, is that there's no silver bullet single fuel substitution that you can make away from heavy fuel oils to one single fuel. Yeah. That's a technical challenge, because it then means the existing refueling infrastructure, port infrastructure that exists, you can't just switch it over. You'd have to build kind of bespoke infrastructure for the different fuel options that you're discussing. So it's not it's not an insurmountable challenge, though. It's definitely a solvable one. I think the bigger issue is the political element of this, where shipping by its very nature operates in international waters between different legal jurisdictions, countries, etc. And the IMO are obviously trying to balance the aspirations of developing economies who want to kind of produce goods, move lots of goods, buy lots of goods, with the developed economies who have a slightly different view and are realizing maybe we need to address some of the negative externalities we've created. So obviously the net zero framework was supposed to come into effect, or there was a vote that would hopefully make it come into effect in October last year. That got delayed by a year, principally because the US took a different view at the 11th hour of their support of that framework. But the challenge really is getting a very diverse global market to agree on one set of rules. And that one set of rules is key because of the international nature of shipping. It can't be that the US has one version and Europe has another. We all have to work around a common set of goals and frameworks. So I remain confident that we will get something, but with the world as it is, with energy prices spiking, availability of this stuff becoming scarcer, it will remain a larger political challenge, I would say, than a technical challenge across the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and obviously the energy crisis that we're seem to be emerging from at the minute is largely a shipping crisis
Yeah.
in many ways. And one of the stats that always surprised me is about 40% of international shipping is moving fossil fuels around the globe. So personally, I'm interested if we decarbonize the rest of the economy, what that will do to the shipping sector.
Yeah, and I think you highlight it well. Shipping serves as a service to lots of other sectors in terms of moving goods and fossil fuels as it exists today. So it goes hand in glove with a wider decarbonisation effort. But as a shipping company, surely it's a logical approach to say, let's try and wean ourselves off of these increasingly volatile fuels in terms of price and availability to something that is more available, more reliable, and allows us to control our costs, and kind of run a shipping company in a profitable way. But it is very challenging, I would say, because there's no silver bullet solution and it's an international problem rather than a region specific problem.
Yeah. And it strikes me, not knowing much about the sector, that there's a sort of real first mover challenge because I remember, in the early days of smartphones, they said one of the adverts said, "Be the first amongst your friends with picture messaging," to which my immediate reaction is surely want to be the second. Because it's not so there's not much point in having a ship running on ammonia or one of these other alternative fuels if you can't get it at all the ports where you need to refuel. So is the IMO program, are you aware of whether that is looking at getting that sort of minimum viable infrastructure in place to
Yeah, I think their
provide?
approach has been about establishing green shipping corridors. So the very popular routes from A to B, say Shanghai to Rotterdam, trying to get the infrastructure at both ends of that route. So then those ships do have bunkering facilities available to them, and that it's never going to cause them an issue. So I think getting a proof of concept that works on the key shipping routes proves that this is the right move forward, the right direction, and then it can scale to all other routes. But it does come back to that problem of there's no single fuel option. I mean, LNG obviously is very popular at the minute, and lots of companies have moved towards those. But it's the more novel technologies. And I think the key thing as well is understanding not all alternative fuels are equal. When you look at the full well to wake emissions from these, there's quite a large variance. So you have to take that into account as well, that when we actually account for the production of our hydrogen, for instance, and it's come from one production method or another, we need to ensure that it is the lowest impact solution. So yeah, I think green shipping corridors are kind of the tool that's being rolled out at the minute, but that's quite a long process as well. There's huge infrastructure projects that need to happen, and then there's a huge amount of compliance that needs to happen to ensure it's safe to operate, and all of the possible negatives have been taken out of the system, so no one's gonna have an issue.
And if you were going to bet on a winner of those alternative fuels, which one would you put your money on?
uh I actually wouldn't bet at the minute. I think it's quite wide open. I couldn't give you an answer on that.
Fair enough.
I know in kind of, if we weren't looking at commercial shipping and we were looking at, say, vessels below 100 meters in waterline length, there's quite a large push at the minute towards HVOs, so a diesel replacement being hydrotreated vegetable oil, and the different ways you can create HVO. That looks like an interesting one. And then longer term on that is the creation of what you would call an e-fuel, so a synthetic hydrocarbon-based liquid fuel. That seems to be a bit of a silver bullet, but scaling that to commercial production volumes also remains a large headache from both the funding and the infrastructure required to create those.
Yeah. And of course, if we went back a couple of 100 years, the global shipping trade worked on the wind. You were involved in the Wind Wings project, which is sort of trying to bring wind back to the cargo
Yeah, it's
area.
funny, isn't it?
Tell us
Yeah.
about that. Sorry, I should ask you to explain what it is first, what it looks like, and tell us about the technical issues involved in it.
Yeah, so I think it's quite amusing, isn't it, that we're looking back to technologies that we wrote off and now looking to bring them back in. So we did a project in 2025 with a company called BAR Technologies, who are developing a fixed wing sail to go on board large commercial vessels. So essentially using the power of the wind to reduce the engine fuel requirements and the associated emissions. So it works on quite simple principles of, rather than using a flappy sail that we used to use and you see on lots of sailing boats nowadays, you use a fixed wing sail like an aerofoil design. Which is much more efficient in converting wind energy into forward propulsion. So we did a project with those guys to look at the full life cycle emissions of the production, kind of use and end of life treatments of one of these 30-meter, or I think it was 24-meter wind wings we actually did the study on. And they are a really interesting option as a transitionary solution, I would say, from where we are today to where we might be in the future with alternative fuels really solving the problem. Using wind can reduce emissions from between 10 and 30% on a given route. And what's fascinating there is if you look at a lot of the shipping routes that we use, they still do kind of follow these global wind patterns, because of the way ports were built hundreds of years ago and these major locations have developed. So the challenge with wind wings, one is kind of the fitment on board vessels. They don't work for everyone, but they do work for some. And then trying to optimize your vessel routing to make the most of the available trade winds that we have kind of circulating the planet. So I strongly believe in it as a very good transitionary tool for the shipping industry. And then the finances of it as well, they often pay back quite quickly because you're reducing a huge amount of fuel consumption in your voyage. The trade-off being it might take slightly longer, for instance, because you're getting this optimized route. But where it then becomes a really interesting solution is the concept of kind of slow steaming, where one of the biggest constraints in the shipping sector is port capacity. So when you're putting your goods on board a container ship and you're shipping it from Shanghai to Rotterdam, that ship is always trying to move as fast as possible between A and B. But often it will then get to Rotterdam and it will sit at anchor for a period of time because the port doesn't have capacity to offload. So actually looking at routing to optimize the arrival time to sync up with the capacity of the port, that is a two-factor kind of way of reducing impact. One, because if you're moving slower through the water, you're using less fuel in your engines, but it also gives you greater scope to maximize the wind that's available to further reduce those engine emissions. But that is a bit of a system redesign and getting ports to properly communicate capacity and availability at a global level so you can plan those routes to really arrive just at the point that you can offload, rather than sitting, for a week, 2 weeks on generators whilst you're waiting to move into the port to offload.
Yeah. And then obviously you'd need to factor in port capacity, you need to factor in the weather conditions on the route,
Yep.
and so you're optimizing. Perhaps a use for AI that's actually
And
do
they
something
already
useful.
are, yeah. So I think, yeah, they've taken these backcast weather models,
Yeah,
the weather data that we've had for a huge amount of time, and they're now plugging those into large language models to say, okay, what is the optimal solution based on the weather we've had to date? And kind of planning those routes. But then you come into the challenge of climate change and its exponential effects on weather systems,
yeah,
and how, just in the UK in the last week, we've obviously had this massive heat wave, and you're seeing this increasingly volatile weather environment because of the global warming that we're
yeah,
seeing. So there's a lot of variables that you have to factor into these models to
yeah.
come up with the best solution.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned before that you specialize in the sub 100-meter uh, vessel in this section of the sector. Could you tell us about that? What sort of boats are you or ships? Are the ships or boats at that size? I'm not sure. The limits my knowledge here. But tell us about that sector you specialize in.
Yeah, so our kind of real sweet spot is working. We actually do a lot of work in the high performance sailing sector. So a lot of offshore racing. If you think of kind of Vendée Globe type racing, as well as then the Sail GPs, the America's Cup, those sorts of vessels. And then alongside that, we do a lot in the leisure marine sector. So what you'd perhaps class as your kind of nice sailing yachts, 40, 50-foot sailing yachts, but also up to then the more luxury motor yacht end of the segment. And the reason we ended up in that sector, one, that's kind of what my professional background was, in those sorts of vessels and building and making and selling those boats, but also the project Marine Shift 360, which we now run, that started out of the America's Cup campaign that Ben Ainsley ran in about 2017, 2018.
Yeah,
So that campaign had a sponsor called 11th Hour Racing, as well as Land Rover were a main sponsor. 11th Hour Racing were one of the sponsors there. And 11th Hour Racing are an ocean conservation charity based out of North America. And as part of the sponsorship of the campaign, they said to the team, we would like you to calculate the environmental impact of running an America's Cup campaign to see how big or small or what it is, and what we could do to perhaps reduce that in the future. So they created this very basic at the time life cycle assessment tool that enabled you to calculate emissions around production use and end of life phases. That project, they then realized actually there's a lot of value in understanding where our impact occurs today, because it really guides what you should focus on in what order to reduce impact. Is it material substitutions, moving away from carbon fiber to a different fiber, or is it actually the energy we use in our facilities to build these high performance boats? That then started an 8-year journey of taking that initial, what you would call a test rig LCA tool, into then what is now today the most widely used life cycle assessment software in kind of the leisure marine industry. We've got over 1,000 users. We've done 15,000 LCA assessments in the tool, and kind of helped a lot of companies reduce their impact. And that naturally scaled from kind of high performance racing into leisure marine. And then in the last year or two, we've then transitioned much more towards the commercial maritime, commercial workboats, ferries, passenger transport, because a lot of the core principles around how you measure impact and then work out decarbonisation pathways, they work across all of these different types of vessels. You might be using different materials and different propulsion systems, but the core methodology applies to all.
yeah. And then I was just thinking, about the relationship between, in particular, sailing, maybe more than uh, the motor yacht, but that relationship with the natural environment. Ellen MacArthur famously set up around the world yachts person, for anybody who's too young to remember the days of her ploughing the oceans on her own, and giving those wonderful and quite emotional reports back on video. But then she, on dry land, set up the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which promotes circular economy. So, do you think there is a relationship between, I'm maybe putting words in your mouth here, a love of sailing and a sort of understanding of the wider environment?
Definitely. I think sailing as a way to spend your time, it's inherently connected and reliant on natural resources, the water you're sailing on, but also the wind that's propelling you forward. It enables you to access some of these amazing remote locations, bays that you just can't get to otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it allows you then to see firsthand the negative impact of some of our activities and what that's doing with nature. So 100%, I think a lot of sailors are probably passionate environmentalists as well, because they want to protect the environment in which they get to spend and enjoy their time. And the example with Ellen MacArthur is fantastic. She obviously was an incredible athlete in her own right and multiple round the world records. But she saw, and I think there's some amazing quotes and speeches she's done where she's in the Southern Ocean and then she's seeing pollution that just shouldn't be in this pristine, untouched environment. And that then obviously stimulated her to go and really question the underpinning fundamentals of the economic system and do some amazing work.
Yeah. And you already mentioned before the effect of climate change, obviously, on weather systems. And, the one thing you look at as a sailor is weather, whether
Yeah.
you're a motorboat or a particular a sailboat, because you're getting it right in your face, literally.
Yeah, and you're very vulnerable on the water. It's not like you're in your car where if something goes wrong, you can call the AA or the emergency services. When you're offshore on a boat, you have to be completely self-reliant because you can't just pick up the phone and ring for help. You've got to work out how to solve the problem. So if you're facing these volatile weather systems, you have to be 100% prepared and self-sufficient in dealing what's in front of you. And I think another one where it comes back to the circularity concept. When you're on board a vessel doing large ocean passages, you need to maximize the resources that you have on board, because you can't pop down to Tesco's or the Co-op to stock up when you run out of bread. If you're at sea for 60 days, you need to have everything on board and you need to really use your resources efficiently. And I think, again, Ellen MacArthur's talked about that a lot, that when you're doing a round the world record attempt, you're not stopping and pulling it into port. You've got to have your water maker working perfectly. So you've got drinking water, you've got to have renewable energy generation on board to top up batteries, to run your communication systems. It's a real self-sufficiency requirement when you're at sea, which I think then promotes the people who enjoy that sort of pastime, really focusing on minimizing their impact on land as well.
Yeah. And, obviously, if you're talking about up to 100-meter size, we're talking about the owners of these vessels are often captains of industry. Do you think they're receptive to greener designs? And, might it be concepts they might take back to the office when they're finished their time on their boat?
Yeah, it's an interesting angle. And I think, talking from personal experience, some of the projects that we've undertaken on what you would deem larger super yachts have been driven by these very successful, wealthy individuals who obviously have, good businesses in the real world as such. But they've realized that they also need to be cognizant and aware of the activities they have in their personal life that aren't super negative. Obviously, you've got lots of billionaires who fly around the world in private jet, have multiple super yachts, and probably don't really care for the climate so much. But I think there's a lot of people who realize they are in view of the wider public, and their behavior in their personal life is as important as the behavior in their professional life. So we've done projects kind of looking at refits on larger vessels, optimized around really reducing the impact of that boat, because they've come under scrutiny in their professional life for the way they behave in their personal life, not aligning with the business values that they're portraying. Lots of large corporates are trying to, portray an image of sustainability and ESG policies and impact reduction. But if you're then jumping on your super yacht, having flown there on your private jet, it's a juxtaposition between this professional and personal image that doesn't really work in the modern world of social media and people being called out.
Yeah. And you know, you've done, or you've your software has supported thousands of life cycle assessments. What are the key impacts? What are the key issues for different types of vessel?
Yeah, it's really variable from the projects we've done. The interesting angle that gets talked about is often, and I mentioned it at the start of the podcast, where we were just looking at changing the propulsion system on a boat. We thought that's how we reduced our emissions. But the interesting fact with a lot of leisure vessels, so, boats below 80 meters, they spend up to 95% of their life in a marina, not actually going anywhere.
Yeah.
Again, owned by busy people who don't actually have time to use the boats. So swapping the propulsion system won't necessarily reduce the emissions across the full life cycle of the vessel. So this was one of the really interesting insights we had probably 7 or 8 years ago, which then switched our focus towards the production phase of a boat. So what could we actually do in the materials we're using, the production processes, the energy required, the transport systems to get raw materials to a manufacturing location to reduce the production phase, because we realized use phase in some cases is not the biggest part of the impact puzzle.
Mhm.
And that then is where our expertise really is around the engineering and design challenge of changing from say, a carbon fiber or glass fiber based boat to a natural fiber or a recycled hydroformed aluminium structure. There's lots of different options, and kind of what we specialize in is simulating all of these out to give you the best route forward. But yeah, in leisure vessels, often it's not the propulsion system that needs changing.
Mhm.
It's the other parts of the system. And what we encourage people to do is really take a holistic view across the whole boat and ensuring that making one change here doesn't create a negative change later on in the life cycle of the vessel. But then obviously in commercial vessels where there's really high utilization rates, e.g. the boat's used every day for multiple hours, it then does switch much more back towards energy systems, propulsion systems. Hull design is a really interesting one as well, where for many, many years, we overcame inefficient hull design by throwing more power at the problem, because power and the fuel that provides the power was cheap and abundant. And that led to perhaps some inefficient choices around how the way hulls work. So a lot of the work we're seeing now is around quite different hull designs. So the obvious one is foiling boats becoming much more popular, because you're then moving the mass out of the water. There's a lot less to move forward because you're on hydrofoils, but also just traditional planing hulls moving towards, there's a company we work with called Pete Step, who reimagined how the hull works. And you're seeing 20 to 25% efficiency gains just by changing the hull shape. And the benefit of that is it also is a more comfortable boat to be on, less vibration, all of those sorts of things. So the marine industry, in the leisure side is definitely a cottage industry. So often you didn't have access to the advanced design tools that could give you these efficiency savings that we saw in other industries.
Mhm.
But yeah, it really varies. And that's why everything we do generally starts with the baseline measurement of the impact of the product you're using today to work out where the hotspot areas are and where you're going to find reductions with any changes you make.
Yeah. Just struck me though, if I take your point absolutely that a leisure vessel can sit in a marina for 95% of the time, but when the owner's on it, if they fire up the engine and it's chug 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 of a diesel engine, that must, even if you've optimized everything else, that must have a sort of visceral impact. That how could this be a clean boat if it's chugging away and there's diesel fumes coming out so there must be a little bit of a perception issue in there as well as the hard numbers.
Yeah, completely agree with you. I think, any leisure boat can't ever truly be called green because, what's the noble purpose of this boat is to go and have fun on the water and enjoy time. That's a difficult justification to make. It's not like the renewable energy industry. We need electricity to power our homes and provide light and energy. So that absolutely, I think it's a phased approach in this industry with kind of addressing the low hanging fruit first, where we can make system changes to reduce impact whilst we're waiting for these key evolutions in the propulsion systems. So today, there was a lot of work, and obviously this is where I started, electrifying, moving away from petrol and diesel drivetrains to electric drivetrains. The issue with electrification in the marine industry is it's something in the region of 10 times more energy required to overcome the drag you see in water than the aerodynamic drag and rolling resistance drag you see in a car, for instance. So we've got amazing battery technology in the automotive side, and we're seeing increasingly large range from electric cars, but you still need loads of energy to propel a boat through the water because of the level of drag you see. And that's where you can electrify a lot of these boats, and loads of people are doing it, but you often comes with a trade-off of quite significantly reduced range, where you can't go as far as you would like to go. And then there's also the infrastructure challenge we mentioned in the maritime sector. At a port level, you see it at a marina level where there isn't an abundance of electric charging facilities. It's definitely growing and it's becoming available. But at the minute, it's not a widespread kind of solution that's available today.
Yeah, and I suppose the more controversial issue regarding efficiency would be anti-fouling. Traditional anti-fouling TBT type materials were highly toxic, but we were always told, well, it's a trade-off between the efficiency of the vessel and because if shellfish and whatnot attach themselves to the hull, then it massively slows the vessel down. So what's the latest in anti-fouling? Is there?
Yeah, I think the leisure side does look a bit more towards the maritime side on this. So there's a lot around ultrasonic anti-fouling systems, so putting vibrations through the hull structures to prevent any growth happening in the first instance. It's trying to move away from the toxic chemicals that we've used, which probably have been relatively efficient in preventing growth, towards these ultrasonic air lubrication systems is another one, where you're putting this thin layer of air between the hull surface and the water surface to reduce the drag and prevent growth. So completely agree with you that the industry needs to move away from your traditional toxic paints. And again, lots of development taking place. Is there a silver bullet right now? No, I don't think there is. But I'm a big believer that the speed of change we're seeing with AI and kind of the technological advances within 5 to 10 years, I would be quite confident in saying that there'll be a more widespread solution for all vessel sizes.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that's a real challenge. There was talk some time ago of they it was always talked about mimicking shark skin,
Yeah.
and I think the U.S. Navy certainly ran trials on a coating which had that same effect as shark skin, because obviously nothing grows on a shark. And they, I suppose the application that it was then banned from was swimsuits of elite
Yeah.
athletes, and they were banned for being too efficient through the water. So it shows there's something there. But is that progressed, or is that just still a bit of a theoretical solution? Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know particularly on that one. I know, wider spread application of biomimicry, so taking nature-based solutions into kind of more technological applications is an increasingly popular topic. But I'm struggling right now off the top of my head to give you an example of that. Yeah.
Well, I take it if you don't know it, then it's probably still, in niches or a theoretical
Yes.
solution, if it's not a standard practice. Yeah. And you wrote a piece, we talked about captains of industry and sort of influencing the boardroom, whether or not, the relationship between work and play in terms of sustainability. But you wrote a piece called "Why the Most Important Climate Decisions Never Reach the Boardroom." So what was the thesis of that?
Yeah, so that piece was based largely on the time I spent in what I would call more corporate sustainability. So consulting into your larger multinational organizations, where their approach was often to create a dedicated sustainability team, which was a good thing, director, a head of, a manager of, whatever it was, and then ask that team to go out and let's make sustainability happen in our business. But the reality is, when you're in, as an example, a product-based business, whether you're making laptops, mobile phones, boats, or cars, a lot of the decisions that need to be made to actually reduce impact happen across the whole organization, from your designers and engineers to your supply chain procurement teams to your facilities management teams. So the concept of embedding sustainability into, or giving it its own singular department and then asked to go and work across the organization, what we experienced, or I experienced, was often the sustainability team were brilliant. They were super motivated. They had the right ideas, but the rest of the organization would not buy into that. They were like, we're too busy. We're trying to solve this problem over here. We've got this deadline to hit. So, we can't help you. And the data that you often need to enable sustainability and decarbonisation to happen sits across all layers of the organization. So what the article was kind of talking about is how we need to rethink sustainability capability within organizations by embedding it across all departments and upskilling all of those teams and making it kind of this central skill that everyone possesses. Having it in a siloed department, one of the bigger issues there is what I'd call decision proximity. So the people who make the choices that are actually going to move us forward in this regard, they're quite far away, one, from the C-suite, but two, from that sustainability team, who often were tasked with creating their annual report and then creating some projects and initiatives. So what we often try to do in the client engagements we have is fundamentally upskill the whole organization on the topic and give them the skills to make the decision at their level of the business that's going to move things forward. It's not something that I've seen talked about that widely. I've seen a few bits recently on the topic, but we need to rethink in a corporate environment how we create these skills. Hence why a lot of the work we do now is working with universities, early years graduates, as they transition into the industry, to give them the right skills to question decisions that are being made. Because what's obvious is the current business models we have won't see us through the next 30 years. They're very short term in their outlooks, and we need to change that.
Yes, I sometimes say middle management is where environmental projects go to die, which is, I think, what you're talking about, and the need, which is it's music to my ears, because I always preach that instead of having a green silo, or even worse, trying to make massive change happen through volunteer champions, you need to target the people who actually have authority to change things and align responsibility and authority. I think that is a crucial issue. So I probably haven't given you enough space as yet. So here's your opportunity to plug the platform you provide. What does it give the users? I suppose you should say who your typical clients are, and what do they get from your system?
Yeah, so the core of what our business does nowadays is create and develop and distribute the Marine Shift 360 lifecycle assessment software. So lifecycle assessment software, there's loads of different organizations and platforms that you can use, but often they're quite broad. They can be a bit of a challenge to use. You do need specialist training to understand which characterization model do I need, which database should I connect to it, all of those sorts of challenges. So what we created was what is known as a streamlined lifecycle assessments platform that's dedicated to the marine industry. So our focus is on water sports brands, boat builders, across all different vessel categories and sizes, who are interested in understanding what their impact is today, and then using the tool to simulate lots of different variables within their production system to find the lowest impact solution. So it's free to access initially. So there's no cost to get the basic version of the software. And then as you want additional functionality, additional impact categories, reporting, all that sort of stuff, then there's license options on top. We create and build and develop the software, but we also then run something, we run an impact accelerator program with 3 companies per year. So last year we worked with the RNLI, in the UK, and we also worked with BAR Technology on the Windwings project we just talked about. And then this year we've got some really interesting companies. One of the largest composite manufacturers in the world, Gurit. We've then got one of us, a much smaller but very innovative composites company called Northern Lights Composites, based in Italy, who are trying to create the world's first true circular composite material, where it's fully recyclable, it goes back, and there isn't a downgrade of materials. And then we're also working with an electric foiling ferry company called Mobifly, who are based out of Switzerland, to help scale their technology. But the Impact Accelerator is, at its heart, is trying to create these flagship case studies to prove that all of the concepts around lower impact materials, lower impact manufacturing processes actually are commercially beneficial as much as they are reducing the environmental impact of these operations. So yeah, we kind of do those two key things. And then the third one is we do a lot of education. So we run a couple of marine impact labs per year, which are face-to-face live activations of all of the work we do and teaching people the fundamentals and basics of LCA and sustainable strategy creation. And then also we've got various online e-learning assets we do. And then alongside all of that, we obviously do some advisory and consultancy work. So at the minute, one of the more interesting projects is with World Sailing, who are the governing body for the sport of sailing, where we're looking and measuring the impact of Olympic class sailing. So that's looking towards LA 2028 and Brisbane 2032, changing the rules and regulations around the competitive angle of sailing in the Olympics to reduce the impact of the products they're using and the way the campaign cycles run. So kind of where you've got a very global international event calendar, is there a different way of optimizing that to reduce impact, as well as then the boats, the windsurfers, the kite foils, the fundamentals of how those products are manufactured and distributed, changing those models as well. So yeah, quite a varied set of work at the minute.
Yeah, yeah. It looks if you're busy for this, very busy for the foreseeable future. And if anybody listening to this wants to get in touch, find out more about Marine Futures, where's the best place for them to start?
Yeah, so our website is marine-futures.com. Also LinkedIn, we're very active on LinkedIn. And then also the secondary website is marineshift360.org, which is more focused on the life cycle assessment platform we run. And we post lots of case studies and interesting information and education assets, as well as the core software on that website.
Fantastic. I'm sure a lot of people will be following up on that. Well, that just leaves me to thank you very much, Ollie, for joining us today. I find that fascinating. I've expanded my tiny bit of knowledge of sustainability at sea quite considerably just talking to you. But so thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thanks for your time, Gareth.